Guys, don't forget to subscribe and share this video with your friends and family. Also, let me know where you're watching from. I never thought much about the people my daughter, Lila, chose to spend time with. She's always been the kind of kid who sees things others don't. Quirks, oddities, the unnoticed. But there was one friendship that still gives me chills when I think about it. One I can't forget no matter how hard I try. It all started when we moved to a small coastal town in Maine. My job at the local library had given us a reason to leave the city behind. Lila adjusted quickly. She always did. With her outgoing nature and curious spirit, I figured making new friends would be easy for her. For the first few months, everything seemed perfect. She came home from school with stories about her classmates, about art projects and playground games. But most of all, she talked about Clara. From the way Lila spoke, you'd think Clara was some kind of fairy tale character. She knows all the best hiding spots, Lila would say, and she tells the coolest stories about the forest. I assumed Clara was just another kid with an overactive imagination. I didn't think much of it, until the phone call. It was a Tuesday afternoon when the school principal called. He said there had been an incident involving Lila and Clara. My stomach tightened. Lila wasn't the type to get into trouble. She wasn't shy, but confrontation wasn't in her nature. The principal insisted I come in immediately. Lila was waiting for me in the hallway when I arrived. Her shoulders were hunched and her usual bright eyes were dull. She wouldn't speak when I asked her what happened. Not a word. The principal led us into his office and began asking me the usual questions, questions that didn't seem to matter. How was Lila at home? Was she respectful? Did she ever display aggressive behavior? I answered honestly. Lila was the gentlest soul I knew. Then came the story. After lunch, the class had gone out for recess. Lila and Clara stayed behind, the last ones on the playground. According to the report, without warning, Lila shoved Clara hard enough for her to hit the ground. Clara screamed so loudly that teachers came running. The strange part? No one saw it happen. But both girls told the same story. Lila pushed her. I was stunned. Lila had never been violent. And what's more, she always spoke so highly of Clara. It didn't add up. The principal reassured me that no punishment would follow. Kids had scuffles after all. But Lila's silence gnawed at me. On the drive home, she kept her gaze fixed out the window. Only later that night, just before bed, did she finally speak. "Mom," she whispered, "Clara made me do it." Her voice was shaking. I sat beside her on the bed and urged her to explain. The story that spilled from her lips froze me in place. According to Lila, Clara had convinced her to play a game in the woods behind the school, a game she called the Echo Man. Clara said that if you whispered your name into the hollow of a particular tree 3 times, the Echo Man would come. Lila didn't believe her, but Clara was insistent. They went together after lunch. Clara whispered her name. Then, as Lila leaned in to do the same, Clara whispered something else, something in a language Lila couldn't understand. That's when Clara changed. She wasn't Clara anymore, Lila said, her voice barely audible. Her eyes were wrong. She kept saying the same word over and over, Silas. And then she said if I didn't push her, something bad would happen. I didn't know what to say. My rational mind wanted to dismiss it all as a child's overactive imagination. But there was something in Lila's face, something terrified and real, that made me pause. Determined to get to the bottom of this, I contacted Clara's mother, Evelyn. She answered on the second ring, her voice warm and polite. When I brought up the incident, she sighed heavily, almost as if she had been expecting the call. "I'm so sorry," she said. "Clara has always been complicated." Complicated. The word hung in the air. Evelyn confessed that Clara sometimes slipped into episodes, moments where she acted like a completely different person. Doctors had brushed it off as a phase, but some things couldn't be explained so easily. I expected her to deny Lila's version of the story, but she didn't. Instead, she suggested a sleepover so the girls could make amends. She offered to host, claiming Clara always seemed calmer at home. Reluctantly, I agreed. Maybe this would put everything behind us. That Friday, Lila and I drove to their house, a pale blue cottage sitting at the edge of the woods. Evelyn greeted us warmly, offering tea while the girls ran off to Clara's room. She seemed genuine, kind. I wanted to believe everything was normal, but the night didn't end normally. The next morning, I arrived to pick Lila up. She was waiting at the door, her face pale, her backpack clutched tightly in her hands. She didn't say a word on the drive home. Halfway there, the tears came. "Lila," I said softly, "what happened?" Her answer chilled me to the bone. "She talked to the mirror," Lila whispered. "Clara wasn't there. It was Silas. He said he'd come for me next time." I pulled over, my hands trembling on the steering wheel. Lila described how, after the lights went out, Clara had stood in front of the bedroom mirror, whispering to her reflection. The same strange words as before. But this time, Lila heard one word clearly. Silas. The reflection in the mirror didn't match Clara's movements. And when Clara finally turned around, her face wasn't right. She smiled, but it wasn't her smile. "He said I was next," Lila repeated, her voice hollow. I drove straight home, heart pounding. That night, I tried to call Evelyn, but her number was disconnected. The following day, when I returned to the blue cottage, it was empty. No sign of Evelyn or Clara, no moving trucks, no explanation. They were simply gone. I searched for them. No phone records, no school files. It was as if they had never existed. Years have passed. Lila grew up, moved on. She barely remembers Clara. But I do. I remember every word, every detail of that night. And sometimes, late at night when the house is still, I catch a glimpse of something in the hallway mirror. A whisper, almost too faint to hear. Silas. The night my father came home. They always said the mountain had a soul. Old, restless, and watching. I grew up in a tiny village carved into its side, where stories of spirits whispered through narrow alleys and flickering lantern light. But in our house, there were no ghosts. My father made sure of that. He believed in things far darker. "The mountain doesn't have spirits," he'd say, tapping the side of his head. "It's got shadows, and shadows don't whisper. They take." Father's words never sat right with me. But you don't question a man who comes down from the mines covered in dust, his eyes hollow from what he's seen beneath the earth. His superstitions ran deep. Every door had a charm above it. Salt lined our windowsills. My mother once dared to laugh at these habits. She didn't laugh for long. Unlike father, mother wasn't afraid. She wasn't particularly faithful either. She believed in the practical, bread, tea, and sunlight. Whenever I asked her why she never went to the temple with us, she'd shrug. "The gods don't bother me, and I don't bother them." It seemed to work for her, for a time. But things began to shift when the mine swallowed father for 3 straight days. When he came back, something was different. He didn't speak about what happened down there. No one did. The other miners said nothing, only gave me looks. Pity, worry, fear. Father walked slower after that. His skin had taken on a strange pallor, his hands always trembling. But the worst part was his eyes, like he'd seen something too big for a man to hold in his head. Mother tried to act as if everything was normal, but I caught her watching him when she thought I wasn't looking. Her smile didn't quite reach her eyes anymore. Something had crept into our home, quiet and slow. Then came the night I won't ever forget. It began with a dream, or at least, I thought it was a dream. I was lying on my mat when I heard the door creak open. Heavy footsteps echoed down the hall. The air turned thick, pressing on my chest. My father's figure appeared in the doorway. But his face, it wasn't right. His mouth twisted into a grin too wide, his eyes glinting with something I couldn't name. Without a word, he grabbed my wrist, cold fingers, far too strong, and shook me violently. I woke gasping, drenched in sweat. But then I heard it, the door creaking. the same footsteps. And there he was, standing in my doorway exactly as he had in the dream. The same grin, the same glint in his eyes, the same crushing grip on my wrist. I screamed. Mother burst in, pulling him away. He blinked, confused, releasing me at once. "What's going on?" he mumbled. He had no memory of what he'd just done. Mother tried to brush it off, said he must have been sleepwalking, but the way his gaze lingered on me told me otherwise. Weeks passed. The incident faded into an uneasy silence until the night the mountain called again. It was deep into autumn when I heard the screaming, not from the house, but outside, beyond the garden where the forest touched the edge of the village. I ran to the window and froze. There, illuminated by the pale glow of our lantern, was Father. He stood barefoot in the dirt. His shirt clung to his skin, soaked through with sweat. But what made my stomach turn was what he held in his hands, a massive, writhing serpent. My father hated snakes. I remembered him refusing to step foot in the temple because of the serpent carvings along the entrance. Yet here he was, cradling one like a prized possession. His eyes locked onto mine. "Come here." His voice was soft, coaxing. I shook my head, stumbling back from the window. He took a step forward, lifting the snake higher. His smile stretched, wide, unnatural. I slammed the window shut, backing away until I hit the wall. From behind the glass, I watched as he slowly lowered the snake and let it slip back into the darkness of the trees. By dawn, he was at the breakfast table, as though nothing had happened, asking why I looked so pale. When I mentioned the night before, his expression clouded with confusion. "Dreaming again, are you?" he chuckled. But there was something in his tone, a hollow ring that made me doubt my own mind. And still, the mountain watched. The last night I spent in that house was the worst. The village temple was hosting a vigil, a night of prayers and stories to keep away the creeping cold of the mountain's breath. I begged Mother to let me stay. She agreed. Father didn't come. He hadn't stepped into the temple since his return from the mines. Around midnight, the first knock came. It wasn't loud, but it cut through the quiet hum of prayers like a blade. The elders paused, glancing toward the doors. A second knock, this time on the far wall, and then another, on the opposite side. The sound began to travel around the temple, circling us like a predator. Some whispered that it was the wind. Others claimed it was the mountain spirit, restless and hungry. But I knew better. The knocking stopped as suddenly as it had begun. We all held our breath as the temple doors creaked open. A figure stood in the doorway. My father, barefoot again, his clothes soaked in sweat, his eyes fixed on me, glowing faintly in the lamplight, and on his face, that same wide, impossible grin. I stepped back, but my legs felt like stone. The elder priest tried to hold me back, murmuring a prayer, but I knew it was useless. Father raised his hand and beckoned. "Come home." I don't remember walking, only the cold air against my face and the distant chants fading behind me. The road home was silent. Father didn't speak. He didn't need to. When we reached the house, he paused at the door and looked at me, long and hard. Then he stepped aside. I ran to my room, bolted the door, and lay awake until dawn. In the morning, the smell of tea and bread drifted from the kitchen. Father was there, humming to himself, cheerful as ever. "Slept well?" he asked, glancing up with that same familiar smile, the one that didn't reach his eyes. He claimed he'd been home all night, swore he hadn't left the house. And when I ran back to the temple, hoping someone could confirm what I'd seen, the priests simply shook their heads. "No one came after midnight," they said. "But I know what I saw. Years have passed. The mountain still stands, silent and watchful. My father is long gone, buried in the shadow of the peak that took so much from him. The villagers say the mountain forgets no one. I believe them, because some nights, when I close my eyes, I still hear the knocking. I never believed in family curses. Growing up in a city apartment above a noisy street market, superstition felt like a luxury for people with less to worry about. But after what happened with my niece and nephew, I'm starting to wonder if some things can't be explained. It started when my sister, Marla, moved her family into an old row house on Kellen Street. The place had history, its red bricks dulled by decades, ivy creeping along the back walls. It wasn't the sort of house you stumbled upon. Marla had specifically chosen it, convinced that the extra space and creaking charm were worth the odd layout and narrow hallways. Her son, Theo, was the first to show signs of something strange. He was 9 at the time, energetic, loud, and curious. The first time she mentioned him sleepwalking, it didn't sound alarming. "Kids do that sometimes," I told her over the phone. "It's normal." But Marla's voice had this tight edge to it. "No, it's not what he's doing, it's where he's going." Theo kept ending up on the 3rd floor, a part of the house that no one really used. It was cramped up there, with sloped ceilings and a single narrow window. Marla said she'd find him standing at the far end of the hallway, facing a blank wall, silent except for the slow drag of his fingers across the plaster. When I visited a week later, I caught a glimpse of it myself. The sound woke me up, a dull, repetitive thump. I lay still for a moment, trying to place it. It wasn't footsteps, not quite knocking either. It was slower, more deliberate, like someone testing the wall's strength. I crept out of bed, the wooden floorboards cold beneath my feet. The 3rd floor had a strange stillness to it, even in the dark. Theo stood at the end of the hallway. His small frame faced the wall, head lowered. His forehead tapped the plaster with an unnerving rhythm, fingers brushing the surface in a slow pattern. "Theo?" I whispered. No reaction. I stepped closer, hesitating just a few feet away. The air felt heavier there, like stepping into a room where someone had been holding their breath for a long time. "Theo?" I tried again, louder. He didn't blink, didn't flinch. He kept tapping, tap, brush, as if trying to remember something just beyond the wall. Finally, I reached out and touched his shoulder. His whole body stiffened. He blinked once, looked up at me like I had woken him from a long nap, and without a word, turned around and went back to bed. He remembered nothing the next morning. The thing that still haunts me is that I didn't tell Marla about what I saw. Not right away. It seemed too strange, too small. I convinced myself it was just sleepwalking. Nothing more, until Ava started doing it. Ava, Theo's younger sister, was only 6 when it began. It started in exactly the same way. Small movements at night, soft footsteps in the hall, then the tapping. Always at the same spot on the 3rd floor. But Ava had never seen Theo sleepwalk. By the time she started, Theo had already stopped. He barely remembered it himself. I stayed at Marla's again when it got worse. I told myself it was to help, but deep down, I needed to see it, to know I wasn't imagining things. And sure enough, one night I woke up to the sound. Tap, brush, tap, brush. When I reached the top of the stairs, there she was, Ava, her small fingers dragging along the wall, her forehead tapping in that slow, methodical rhythm. Her eyes were open but empty, reflecting nothing in the dim hallway light. I called her name. No response. When I touched her shoulder, her body tensed the same way Theo's had. She blinked, stepped back, and without a word, walked back to her room. I told Marla everything after that. We sat at her kitchen table, the early morning sun cutting sharp lines across the worn countertop. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said something that chilled me more than the tapping ever had. "You know what's on the other side of that wall?" she asked. I shook my head. The old stairwell. Apparently, when the house was renovated decades ago, the 3rd floor had been expanded. The original blueprint showed a narrow staircase hidden behind that very wall, a staircase that had been sealed off when the renovations were done. Neither Theo nor Ava could have known that. "Maybe they sensed it," I offered weakly, though I didn't believe it. Marla didn't respond. Weeks passed. The sleepwalking stopped again, as suddenly as it had started. Theo and Ava seemed like their normal selves. The house fell back into its slow, everyday rhythm. But Marla couldn't let it go. She hired a contractor, said she wanted to open up the space. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was fear. Either way, I came over the day they broke through the wall. Dust filled the air as they pried away the plaster, layer by layer. The wooden beams behind it were old, worn smooth in some places. But that wasn't what caught our attention. It was the mirror, tall, narrow, and embedded into the wall like a forgotten doorway. Its surface was dulled with age, but you could still see your reflection, faint and warped, like looking through water. None of us said anything for a moment. "Why would there be a mirror behind a wall?" the contractor asked, brushing off his hands. Marla didn't answer. She was staring at the floorboards in front of the mirror, scratches worn deep into the wood, small, shallow grooves, almost like footsteps. I couldn't stop staring at the glass. There was something about the way it reflected the hallway, almost perfectly, except for one detail. In the mirror, the hallway didn't end at a wall. It kept going,